In my second year in the university, tragedy struck. I was reading in my hostel room when a call came through asking me to come home immediately. Before I could ask what the problem was, the line went dead. I called my mom, but her phone rang through without her picking. I called my dad, and someone who said he was a policeman picked up and said the owner of the phone was just involved in a car accident. Immediately I heard that, I quickly picked a few things and left my hostel for home. I got home hours later to meet lots of people gathered in front of our home. Immediately, I knew the worst had happened. My father was a sole breadwinner. My mom was a full-time housewife. I went into the house and saw my mom crying profusely. Some relatives were beside her trying to console her. Immediately she saw me, she began to call my father's name. I went and sat close to her and did all I could to console her. A week later, my father was buried. After the burial, I decided that I was going to travel to Europe so as to be able to help support my mom and younger siblings. I had heard stories of people who traveled by road, and I made up my mind to go through that route. From a friend whose brother traveled through that way, I got all the information I needed. To raise money, I used my father's land and house as collateral, even without letting my mother know. I told my mom about the trip and she prayed for me. A week later, I embarked on my trip. I traveled from Benin to Kano and got to Agadez in Nigerian Republic 4 days later. I stayed in Agadez for over a week trying to look for the best route. I had two alternatives: going to Libya and connecting to Italy, or getting to Morocco and connecting to Spain. I eventually decided to go to Morocco. We left Agadez early that fateful morning in a Toyota Hilux truck. We drove through towns and most of the time through bush paths. The driver explained that he went through bush paths to avoid the numerous police checkpoints on the main road. We continued like that till the next day, stopping at some points to refresh. By the third day, the vehicle broke down in the middle of the desert. The driver said he was going to get a mechanic and left. We actually spent another 3 days waiting for him to return, but he didn't. The third day, some gun-toting men surfaced and robbed us of all our belongings and threatened to kill all of us. They told us to leave where we were or they would kill us. They actually told us that the driver of that vehicle had been arrested. It was at that point that we deduced that we may have been duped by the driver. We pleaded with them to help us, and they told us that the next city was about 30 minutes walk and directed us on how to go. We followed their direction and started walking. It was after we had walked for over 4 hours and not getting to anywhere that we knew that they had lied to us. As we walked, we saw bones, dried bones. We saw fresh bodies, that is, people who may have died just about some hours or days prior. And then we knew that we may be on the path. So we continued to go. As we saw the dead bodies and the bones, I wept in my heart. I just said to myself that if we had good leaders in Africa, these people may not have died. About 2 people who were with us fell ill along the way, and we had to leave them because there was just nothing we could do. We had no medicines, we had no food, we had no water. So we just trucked on. We continued in the hot desert. We were scorched. We couldn't lie down because the ground was so hot. We just continued to move. Finally, by the 4th day, we got to a village, and there we were able to find water and food. But then we had no money to buy. And so we pleaded and we began to do some odd jobs. I was able to get a bricklayer job, trying to help build a house. After 6 months in that village, I was able to raise some money. I was already connected with a lady called Janet. We got so close, like lovers. From that town, we were able to get transport to help us continue the journey. We continued from one town to the other, taking different vehicles, spending days in some towns until we finally got to a town they said was a border town to Morocco. When we eventually arrived to Casablanca, Janet called her cousin, who eventually gave us a place to stay. This was about 8 months after we left Agadez. Few days after we arrived, I discovered that it was going to take me at least a year or thereabout to raise enough money to pay my way through by boat to enter Spain, because the only job available to illegal migrants like me was washing cars in garages. For women, most of them were into prostitution. Our host said she was a house help. Janet, who already saw herself as my lover, pleaded with her to assist her get a similar job, and she promised to help. About 2 weeks after we got into Morocco, I got back home late one day and heard something that told me that our host had lied about her job. Where we lived was a hostel for women only, so I usually stayed away until very late into the night before I could enter the house. I would need to call first to allow them to open the door for me. That day, I called repeatedly, but Janet nor her cousin wasn't picking my calls. I therefore went to the window to knock, and just as I was about to, I heard our host say, "Janet, if you are not going to do what I've been telling you to do, then you and your boyfriend need to leave this room tomorrow." She said it in a loud, angry voice. I was shocked and listened to hear more. After a long silence, I heard Janet say, "Cousin, it's difficult for me to sell my body to other men. What if Mike finds out? I love him so much and wouldn't want to hurt him." "How is he going to know what you are doing?" our host asked Janet. "Does he know what I do? I'm sure he thinks I'm a house help. And that's what he'll think you are doing also. See," she continued, "if you say you love him, then get into this business now so you'd be able to raise money to pay your way and his to Europe in less than 6 months. That's the only way for now. Take my advice, dear," I heard her say as I heard a car coming towards my direction and I quickly moved away from the window. When I eventually came back to the window, there was silence in the room. I waited for some minutes and still heard nothing, so I tapped on the window and called Janet's name. She eventually opened the door and I behaved like I heard nothing. Actually, 6 months later, Janet told me she'd raised enough money to pay our transport fare to Europe. On the day of our departure to Europe, we boarded the boat at about midnight. The driver of the boat told us they usually traveled late into the night to avoid being seen by the sea police. The journey continued smoothly until he announced that we were close to our destination. Just after he did, a strong wave swept our boat up, and before I knew what was happening, the boat went up, and just as it was landing back, it kind of nosedived and threw most of us into the sea. I think I must have lost consciousness after then, because by the time I woke up, I was in a hospital bed and a beautiful colored nurse was sitting beside my bed. As I looked at her with surprise written all over my face, she smiled at me without saying a word. I asked her where I was and she told me I was in Tarifa. I questioned further and she told me I was lucky that I made it into Spain, unlike many others. She told me that only 11 of us survived, all men, and that many of the bodies haven't been recovered. This told me that Janet must have died with others. I wept like a baby. She asked who the person was to me and I told her how the lady paid my way through. "You must be a very kind-hearted person," she said. Then she asked me if I had a relative I was coming to see in Spain and I said I didn't. Then she wrote out some directions on a paper and told me to go to the toilet and from there leave the hospital quickly. She said the police were going to come check on me in less than an hour and that they may decide to deport me and others. Fearfully, I said I didn't have any money and she said I shouldn't worry. She left and came back with some money. She gave it to me and said I should leave immediately. I pleaded with her to give me her telephone number, but she refused. I quickly left and followed the direction she wrote down until I got to the bus station. From there, I boarded a bus to Madrid. Following her direction, I alighted at the main bus station and boarded another bus that will take me to where she said I would see some people from my country who could help me. As I sat down on the seat, my mind drifted to my mom and younger ones, and then I thought of Janet. I said to myself that if I had died like her, my mom wouldn't know. She'd just be there looking forward to hearing from me, but never will. I thought of the thousands of Africans who died on their way to Europe and how their families will be waiting to hear from them. Life, I thought. I was thinking about this when the bus stopped at a bus stop. Some passengers alighted and some entered. The bus was full because it was the evening rush hour and so many people were standing. One of those that entered was a frail-looking beautiful lady that from my estimation will be in her 60s.
She had a bandage wrapped around her arm to her neck, and she stood by my seat, holding one of the bird standing hangers. I tapped her, and as she looked at me wonderingly, I stood up and asked her to sit. She looked at me with surprise, thanked me, and sat down. Not far from where she entered, she stood up and said she would alight at the next bus stop. She asked where I was going to, and I said I didn't know. I told her I was new in the country and showed her the direction I was given by the nurse, and she told me to go with the bus to the last bus stop. Then she wrote her number on the paper and asked me to call her if I need any help. I thanked her and she alighted.
I got to the last bus stop and alighted. I looked around to see if I would see any African, but saw none. As I was wondering why the nurse directed me to the place, I saw 3 black guys walking towards me. I walked up to meet them. As they got to where I was, just as they wanted to walk past, I greeted them and they stopped. I told them I needed some help and went on to tell them my story. One of them asked if I had any money with me, and I said I had just about 10 euro. Actually, that was all that remained from the money the nurse gave me. One of them told me that there's nothing they could do since I didn't have money. They left me standing there. Not knowing what to do, I decided to walk around to see if I would see anyone to help. I saw a couple from Liberia, but as soon as I told them I was Nigerian, they directed me to a bar where I could see some Nigerians. After over 2 hours of searching for the address, I eventually saw it. I met with the owner of the bar and gave him my story. After a series of questions, he said he would have assisted to help me get a place to sleep if I had some money. As it was getting late, I pleaded with him to allow me pass the night in the bar. He accepted but said I would have to wait until the bar closed. The next day, I decided I was going to call the woman I gave my seat in the bus, but unfortunately, I didn't have a phone. I lost my phone in a boat mishap. I then decided to plead with one of the guys working in the bar for assistance, and he obliged. The lady picked up the call after the first ring. After my explanation, she asked for the address where I was calling from, and I told her I needed to ask the owner of the phone for a proper direction. At that point, she said I should ask the owner of the phone to tell the address to her, and said I should wait that she would send somebody to pick me up. Before I could say another word, she cut the call. About an hour later, a very expensive, luxurious car parked in front of the bar. As I was looking admiringly at the car, a tall, well-dressed white guy came out of the car. He brought out a phone and dialed a number. Just then, the phone of the guy I used his phone to call the woman started ringing. The guy picked the call, and as soon as he listened, he looked towards my direction and pointed to me. Excitedly, I walked towards the white guy. He looked at me and asked if I was Mike, and I said I was. My boss asked me to come pick you up, he said. I was surprised. How could the lady I gave my seat in the bus be the boss of this good-looking guy that looks like a millionaire, I thought. He opened the car for me to enter. Just then, the owner of the bar arrived. Seeing the car with its open door, he beckoned on me to come. He asked me what the problem was, and all I could say was that I would come another time to explain. I thanked the guy that allowed me to use his phone, and with my small bag in hand, I walked to the car, entered, and as I did, the driver closed the door and then went behind the wheel and zoomed off. Less than an hour later, we arrived at a compound that looks like a palace. There were several buildings in the compound, and he drove and parked in front of the house that looked like a castle. As soon as he stopped the car, he opened his door and hurriedly came and opened the door for me. Just as I stepped out, the lady I gave my seat in the bus came out. She was so magnificently dressed that I began to wonder if she was the same lady. We went in, and then I beheld the most beautiful house interior decoration I'd ever seen. As I was wondering, the woman walked to a sofa and sat down. She pointed to another one close to hers and said I should sit down, and I did. I couldn't believe what was happening. It was like I entered a billionaire's den. Welcome to my home, she said. I asked her if she owned what I was seeing, and she said yes. What were you doing in the bus that day, I asked. She laughed aloud before she answered. I do take bus sometimes, she said. I do it just for fun, she said. I was looking at her as she spoke. Before I could ask her another question, a man dressed in cook's uniform entered and announced that food was ready. Immediately, she stood up and asked me to come with her. We walked for a couple of minutes into a beautifully designed dining area overlooking a large kitchen.
We both sat down on the dining chairs, and as I was looking at some of the dishes that I'd never seen, she began to dish some into her plate. I did same without saying a word. "Tell me what brought you to Spain," she asked. I told her my long episode, my father's death, my journey by road, Jane's death, and by the time I finished, I saw tears dropping from her eyes. "So you took all these risks just to help your family?" she asked. I nodded affirmatively. "I will repay your kindness," she said. Before I could ask, she continued, "The fact that you gave me your seat that day told me that you have a compassionate heart. I will give you a job here. I need someone to be an eye here. Of course, there are cameras everywhere, but I need someone to monitor the workers," she said. "I will do whatever you want me to do diligently," I said. 6 months after I started working with a lady, I saw something that explained to me that all was not well with my boss. From what she told me, she inherited huge wealth from her father, who was a billionaire. She was so loved by her father that she received a huge chunk of her father's wealth. Unfortunately, too, she doesn't have any child of her own, even though she said she was married twice. That day, she was having a discussion with one of her siblings, and they were also having a drink. As she stood up and went into a nearby toilet, from a distance, I saw his brother stood up, looked around, and when he seemed sure that there was no eyes watching, he brought out something from his pocket and emptied it into the woman's glass. I had hidden out of his view. Immediately he stood up. As soon as I saw this, I put a call to her and told her what I saw. She thanked me and didn't touch the drink afterwards, even though her brother pressed her to. 1 year after I started working with a lady, the unexpected happened. I didn't see her for 3 days, and when I inquired from the chauffeur, he told me she was on bed rest in the hospital. I called to wish her a quick recovery, but her phone was switched off. The 7th day, I saw some unusual movement in the house that got me so worried. The only person I could ask was the chauffeur, and he too was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't sleep all night. Something deep inside me told me that all was not well. That night, in a dream, I attended a burial ceremony, and just as they were lowering the casket into the grave, I woke up. I couldn't sleep till morning. Same morning, the chauffeur came in wearing a very sad face. He eventually broke the news to me that my boss died 2 days prior. As I heard that, I broke down in tears. I felt my whole life crumble before me. I couldn't think. A week later, she was buried. After the burial, her attorney came to speak with all of us, her workers. He told us to continue with our jobs and that our salaries would be paid continuously. 3 months later, our attorney came to see all the workers again. He called us one after the other into an office that used to be my late boss's. When it was my turn, I couldn't carry my legs to go in. I couldn't imagine going in and not seeing my boss sitting across the table smiling at me like she always did whenever I entered previously. I remember the last time I went in there to see her. She had looked at me and said I should keep being good. That day, she gave me some money to send to my mom and promised me that she was going to help me bring my mom and younger ones over to Europe. I was still thinking about all this when the attorney came out. He asked why I didn't come in, and I told him why. He helped me up and led me to a seat in the living room and told me to sit down, and I did. He went back into the office, and as he was coming out, he had a bulky envelope in his hand. He came and sat beside me and said he had good news for me. As I looked up wondering, he handed the bulk envelope to me and said, "You are the lucky one. She willed everything to you." I looked at him and asked what he meant. He said the same thing again. As soon as the impact of what he said hit me, I passed out. I woke up later in a hospital bed, the kind of bed reserved for kings. I looked around the room and wondered how fate could take me, a poor guy from a poor home, to this height. From what the attorney said, what she willed to me ran into several millions euro. Just one simple act of kindness that I did innocently turned me into a multi-millionaire. People, don't hesitate to do good whenever you can, because you never know what the next chapter holds. Please subscribe to this channel, share, and check out our other beautiful stories. Thank you.